It is now the fourth day of 2021. Today is January 4th, 2021, and tomorrow is the Georgia Senate runoff elections. So these are the two Senate elections that have not finished up yet. Both of them are in Georgia, and both of them are taking place tomorrow on January 5th, 2021. And the reason why we're having these two runoff elections for these two Senate seats in Georgia is because by Georgia law, if a candidate doesn't get 50% of the votes or more in round one of the Senate race, so if no candidate gets at least half the votes in a Senate race in Georgia, then that Senate race has to move to a runoff election. And in the runoff election, the top two candidates from the first round of the election move on and participate in that runoff election. So in the normal Senate election in Georgia, you had David Perdue and Jon Ossoff get in the top two for the most number of votes in the normal Senate election. David Perdue got the most votes. Jon Ossoff got the second most number of votes, but David Perdue only got like 49.7% of the votes, which is just under 50%. So that's why that went to a runoff election. But for the other Senate seat, for the special election, this runoff election will have Kelly Loeffler and Raphael Warnock participating in it because in round one of the election, Raphael Warnock got the most number of votes and Kelly Loeffler got the second most number of votes. So you have the current incumbents for these two Senate seats. They are Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue. Both of them are Republicans, and that does mean that currently the Republicans still have control over the Senate even after the newly elected members of the Senate, the other newly elected members of the Senate, have already taken office. That happened yesterday, but because the two Senate seats in Georgia are both filled by Republicans right now, Republicans still have a majority in the Senate, but that can change with tomorrow's elections if Democrats win both of those Senate seats. If Democrats win both of those seats, if Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock win their respective Senate races, then Democrats will have 50 seats in the Senate, and if there's a tie in the Senate, the vice president is the one who breaks the tie. Kamala Harris is going to be the vice president in just a couple of weeks, and since she's a Democrat, Democrats will essentially control the Senate if they win both of those Senate seats in Georgia. So you have two Republican incumbents, two Democratic challengers, and whoever controls the Senate is dependent on the winners of these Senate races. So Democrats need to win both seats, Republicans only need to win one in order to still have control over the Senate. Since the election is tomorrow, it's almost here, I decided that today would be a good day to look over the polls one last time. Look over the normal election polls and the special election polls, all the polls that have been administered in the past couple months specifically for these two Senate races, and based on that, try to figure out which candidates have a better chance of winning. So, first, I'm going to look at the regular Senate election. So, I'm on 538.com right now. I've been on this website many times. In the month before Election Day, during October, I was on this website so much because of how useful their election statistics are, their election projections are. And I've got to say, for the presidential election, they were accurate in most of their predictions, but I think they were off for a couple of them. Like, they gave Biden a better chance of winning Florida. They gave Biden a decent chance of winning the state of Florida, but in the end, Trump came out on top by quite a bit. But they were also pretty spot on with some other predictions. Like, they gave Trump and Biden a 50-50 chance, each 50% chance of winning Georgia, and the vote came very close in Georgia. So for states like Georgia, 538 was essentially spot on, but for other states like Florida, they were a bit off. But I still think that it's a good website to look at when trying to predict what will happen in an election. So, if you look at the regular Senate election polls, the polling average over time, right after Election Day, sorry, on November 9th, David Perdue is leading in the polls by around 4 percentage points, and I think the main reason for that is because Georgia as a whole just leans slightly more towards the Republicans, slightly more conservative than many other states in the country does. In the 2020 presidential election that just took place 2 months ago as of now, Georgia actually surprised most of us when they voted for Joe Biden over Donald Trump. That definitely surprised me. I thought that Georgia had a much better chance of going towards Trump. And for a while, Trump was leading in that state, but over time, as more and more mail in ballots got counted, because mail in ballots skewed heavily towards Biden in this election, the mail in ballots were eventually able to get Joe Biden over the top, and he was able to win the state of Georgia. I found it very surprising, but it also makes sense when you consider how much effort was put into the state in order to get more people to turn out and to vote. And a large reason why Georgia was won by Biden and not Trump was because Stacey Abrams, she almost became the governor of Georgia back in 2018, I guess a little over 2 years ago at this point. She narrowly lost to Brian Kemp, and because of that, she realized that if she wanted Joe Biden to win this election, she was a Democrat, by the way, she's a Democrat, and if she wanted Joe Biden to win, she realized that she would have to get a lot of people to turn out that normally don't vote, and she was able to pull that off, as we can see, because Joe Biden ended up winning that state. So Joe Biden won the presidential race, but I don't know if the Democratic challengers for these two Senate races are necessarily going to be able to pull off a win like Joe Biden did. I talked about in my prediction video 2 days ago that I predicted that Kelly Loeffler would lose her Senate race, but David Perdue would win his. And the reason for that is because I think that Raphael Warnock and Kelly Loeffler. The thing about Kelly Loeffler is that she is more controversial than many other senators. Just a month after she got into office, back in early January, back in the first month of 2020, she had already gotten herself into a scandal, and this was just weeks after she took office, because she took office at the beginning of last year, at the beginning of 2020, right after Johnny Isaacson retired at the end of 2019. She was not elected, she was appointed by Brian Kemp, so she's never actually been elected to Senator of Georgia until possibly tomorrow if she wins her runoff election. But up until now, she's never been elected as Senator of Georgia. She got appointed, and because of that, a lot of people may not necessarily like her. Like she didn't get to her position in the first place because a lot of people in her state liked her. She only got there because she got appointed by the governor, Brian Kemp. But if she's able to win tomorrow's election, then that might reaffirm a lot of people actually approving of her, even though she had that controversy at the start of last year. But we'll have to see. But I personally think that Raphael Warnock will be able to pull off a win in Georgia just because of that scandal that she got herself involved in, and because of how controversial she is, and also because she never got elected. One more thing I'd like to bring up is that, in my opinion, she did not come off very well in the debate she had against Raphael Warnock. In my opinion, she seemed a bit too robotic, didn't have enough emotion in her speeches, and I think that's why Raphael Warnock won that debate. I talked about it in a video almost a month ago, but I think David Perdue avoids a lot of the problems that Kelly Loeffler has, and that's why I think he will still win against Jon Ossoff. He got elected to his position 6 years ago, and I think he has a lot more emotion in his speeches whenever he speaks than Kelly Loeffler does, and he's not as controversial of a figure as Kelly Loeffler is in many ways. But getting back to the polling numbers, at first David Perdue was ahead by 4 points right after Election Day, but over time Jon Ossoff was able to catch up to him, and for the past month and a half, it's just been back and forth. Jon Ossoff was up by a bit, and then David Perdue was, but they've always been within 1 percentage point of each other. It's been very close. That's why it's hard to tell who's actually going to win these Senate races, and that's why it's really coming down to the wire. But as I speak right now on January 4th, Jon Ossoff is leading in the polls by 1.8 percentage points, but that may not necessarily mean he's going to win tomorrow's election by 1.8 percentage points. The polls, I think the polls are generally a good indicator of who's going to win, but there's also the potential issue that the sample that's being surveyed in these polls is biased, as in the sample that gets surveyed in these polls isn't representative of the population of Georgia as a whole. Now, during the presidential election cycle leading up to the presidential election, the polls were predicting that Joe Biden would have won the popular vote by 7 to 8 percentage points. That was the number of percentage points Joe Biden was up by. But in the actual election, in the actual 2020 presidential election, Joe Biden only won the popular vote by around 5 percentage points, which, don't get me wrong, is still a pretty substantial margin. Joe Biden still won the popular vote very easily, but that doesn't change the fact that the polls did overestimate Joe Biden's performance and underestimate Trump's performance by a couple percentage points. But a couple percentage points is not that much. That is within the margin of error for most of these polls. But I still think that the polls overall are a good indicator of how likely a candidate is to win an election. Like, Joe Biden was always up in the polls leading up to election day, and he still ended up winning the popular vote and electoral college. In 2016, it's true that Hillary Clinton was up in basically every poll leading up to election day 4 years ago, and she did lose the election, but she did win the popular vote. I would also like you to keep that in mind. And the polls did not necessarily factor in the electoral college. They mostly were just keeping track of the popular vote. And Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote, and that's what the polls predicted. Same thing with this time around. The polls predicted that Joe Biden would win by a pretty substantial margin, a bigger margin than Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 4 years ago. And indeed, that's what happened. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 2 percentage points. Joe Biden won the popular vote by around 5 percentage points. So the polls were not that far off in that aspect. But Joe Biden did still underperform based on what the polls were predicting, how well the polls predicted that he would do, and Trump did do better than what he was expected to do based on the polls. And also, I will admit that 538.com underestimated Trump in their projections because the average amount of electoral votes that Joe Biden was expected to win was definitely above 306, but he only ended up winning 306. And Trump was expected to win less than 232 electoral votes, but he did end up winning that many. So I think that the polls did give Joe Biden too high of a chance of winning and Trump too low of a chance of winning by a bit, but they were still, in general, a good indicator. They were still able to predict Joe Biden's victory, so I think that in general, polls are a good thing to rely on. Like, they're probably the best thing there is to be able to predict an election before it actually happens. Especially with 538.com, the kinds of algorithms that they use to project election results, I think are generally pretty spot on. But sometimes they can be off, but that's just because these sorts of things are unpredictable and anything can happen. It's also largely dependent on turnout, the results of these elections. It depends on who actually shows up to vote, and the people who vote in the polls may not necessarily actually show up on election day, and that's something that the polls may not necessarily be able to factor in, but they're still a good indicator overall of what's likely to happen in an election. So I talked about the regular Senate election poll numbers where Jon Ossoff is currently up by 1.8 percentage points, but let's go to the special election now. So a week after Election Day on November 9th, 2020, Kelly Loeffler was ahead by 1 percentage point. Now keep this in mind. She was only up by 1 percentage point at the same time that David Perdue was ahead by 4. So right from the start, Kelly Loeffler wasn't approved of as much as David Perdue was. And David Perdue has always had a better chance of winning than Kelly Loeffler did. And then around middle of November, Raphael Warnock passed her up. And he's been ahead almost all the time ever since. Throughout most of December, Raphael Warnock was ahead, and then Kelly Loeffler caught up to him at one point, and then they were tied for a bit. But then, in the last couple of weeks of December, Raphael Warnock once again pulled ahead in the polling numbers, and as of now, on January 4th, Raphael Warnock is 2.1 percentage points ahead of Kelly Loeffler. That's more than what Jon Ossoff is ahead by 1.8 percentage points. So even if you think that the poll numbers are underestimating the chances of Republicans winning and overestimating the chances of Democrats winning, you still have to admit that Raphael Warnock has a better chance of winning his Senate race than Jon Ossoff does. So I think that Jon Ossoff will personally, I think Jon Ossoff will lose, but Raphael Warnock will win. But it's possible that both of them lose and both of them win. It's just that close in Georgia. Georgia surprised all of us when Joe Biden won that state. So it's entirely possible that Democrats win those two Senate races. It's also entirely possible that Democrats lose both of those races because Georgia in the past few decades has usually voted for Republicans in the presidential elections and in the Senate elections. So it's possible that Georgia, which generally leans a bit more conservative than the country as a whole, does once again stick with that trend and pick both Republican senators, but it's also possible that Democrats do an extra good job of campaigning and do a good job of getting people to turn out, and they're able to win both of those Senate races, and they would have control over the Senate if that happens. We're just gonna have to see what happens. Tomorrow's the day that this election's gonna go down. Both of these elections, I'm not exactly sure if the results are gonna be all in by tomorrow night. We might have to wait till January 6th or 7th, but regardless, in a few days, within the next few days, we're gonna know for sure which political party will have control over the Senate for the next 2 years.